Albert Anastasia. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia walked into the barber shop of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. He sat in the chair, but moments later, two masked men rushed inside. They pushed the barber aside and began shooting. Confused, Anastasia jumped forward and tried to attack what he thought were his killers, but he was only striking at their reflections in the mirror. The gunman kept firing until he collapsed dead on the floor. He had been one of the suspected shooters for Joe the Boss and was the co-founder and leader of Murder, Inc., the Mafia's group of killers. His nickname was the Lord High Executioner. Anastasia controlled much of New York U.S. waterfront and later became boss of what would be known as the Gambino crime family. But he was seen as reckless and unstable. Rumors spread that Anastasia was selling Mafia memberships for money, and his large gambling debts made him appear even more unpredictable. His allies, including Vito Genovese, who we'll talk about later, wanted his power. His underboss, Carlo Gambino, quietly sided with Genovese, agreeing to take over once Anastasia was removed. That October morning in 1957, the plan was finally carried out. Joe the Boss. On April 15, 1931, Giuseppe Masseria, also known as Joe the Boss, sat at a table in the Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant on Coney Island, playing cards. He was relaxed, unaware that his own lieutenant, Lucky Luciano, had already struck a secret deal with rival boss Salvatore Maranzano. During the card game, Luciano got up from the table, leaving Masseria alone. Moments later, gunmen rushed in and opened fire. Masseria was hit in the head, back, and chest, collapsing over the table as the shooters fled. He had been the boss of what would later be called the Genovese crime family, and was one of the most powerful figures in New York. But his hunger for more power created many enemies. By 1930, his drive to control the city sparked the Castellano War, a bloody conflict against Salvatore Maranzano and his allies. At first, most supported Masseria, but as the war dragged on, his side suffered heavy losses. Luciano saw his chance when Maranzano promised him a top position and control of rackets if he betrayed Masseria. Even Joe Adonis, once close to Masseria, joined the plot and secretly warned Luciano when suspicion grew. Among the shooters that day were believed to be Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese himself, and Bugsy Siegel. Outside, Ciro Terranova waited in the getaway car, but he was so shaken after the murder that Siegel reportedly had to push him aside to drive them away. Masseria's death ended the Castellano War and gave Maranzano the title of Capo dei Capi, the boss of bosses. But Luciano had even bigger plans, and soon the world would see why. Salvatore Maranzano. Just months after Joe the Boss's death and his victory in the Castellano War, Salvatore Maranzano was in his Manhattan office inside the New York Central Building. He had called Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese for a meeting. Secretly, Maranzano was planning to have Luciano killed, but what he didn't know was that Luciano was already aware of the plot. Suddenly, 4 men disguised as tax agents entered the building, disarmed the guards, and rushed Maranzano. He was stabbed several times and then shot, dying in his office that afternoon. Why would he want to kill Luciano, even after Luciano had betrayed Joe the Boss to join his side? In the few months he ruled, Maranzano reorganized the Mafia, creating the 5 families of New York, each with its own boss, underboss, and soldiers. But at the same time, he gave himself the title of boss of all bosses. That didn't sit well with Luciano and the younger generation, who saw Maranzano's ways as outdated. He demanded money and respect, disliked Luciano's close ties with non-Italian gangsters like Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, and even compared himself to Julius Caesar, talking about shaping the Mafia like the Roman Empire. To men like Luciano, Genovese, and Costello, he seemed less like a leader and more like a dictator. By September, Maranzano suspected Luciano was plotting against him, so he tried to act first. He hired the Irish gangster Mad Dog Coll to kill Luciano. But Luciano struck before him, sending in the disguised killers who ended Maranzano's life. With Maranzano gone, Luciano abolished the idea of a single boss of bosses. Later, we'll look at the new system he created, Bugsy Siegel. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Siegel, one of the suspected shooters of Joe the Boss, was sitting on a sofa in Beverly Hills reading the Los Angeles Times when bullets suddenly tore through the window from outside. He was struck in the face and chest. One shot destroyed his left eye instantly, and he died on the spot. At that time, Siegel was one of the most famous mobsters in America, even seen as a celebrity. He was central to the development of Las Vegas and had taken charge of the Flamingo Hotel and Casino project, which was financed with money from his mob partners. But the project turned into a disaster. The casino opened before construction was finished, lost huge amounts of money, and went far over budget, from an estimated $1 million to more than $6 million. His mob partners believed he had either stolen money or completely lost control of their investment. Their patience ran out, and behind the scenes, the decision was made that Siegel had become too much of a risk. Who gave the final order is still debated to this day. Paul Castellano. On the evening of December 16, 1985, outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, Paul Castellano, the boss of the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful mafia groups in America, stepped out of his car. Suddenly, gunmen rushed him and opened fire. He was hit several times before he could react, and his newly chosen underboss, Thomas Bellotti, who had been driving the car, was killed right beside him. Across the street, John Gotti sat in a car, watching to make sure the hit was carried out. What led to this moment is a telling story. Castellano ran the family more like a businessman than a street gangster. But many of his men thought he was greedy and too detached from everyday street life. Resentment grew when he refused to allow drug dealing, which had become a major source of revenue. Then the FBI bugged Castellano's mansion, leading to federal charges. In December 1985, his longtime underboss, Agnello Della Croce, died. Castellano didn't attend the wake, which angered the Manhattan faction. Soon after, he named Bellotti as the new underboss, a decision few respected. He also hinted that he might break up John Gotti's crew. For Gotti, that meant if he didn't act first, his own life and power were at risk. All of this led to Gotti's hit at Sparks Steakhouse, carried out in front of busy evening crowds. Only weeks later, John Gotti became the new boss of the Gambino family. Franky Boy. One of the most recent stories happened on the night of March 13, 2019. Gunshots rang out on a Staten Island street, and Francesco Calli, known as Franky Boy, collapsed in front of his home after being hit 10 times with a 9mm handgun. Security cameras later revealed what happened. A pickup truck crashed into his parked Cadillac, forcing him to come outside. Calli walked over to the driver, but things quickly escalated. He tried to hide behind his car, but the shooter opened fire, giving him no chance. Calli had long been seen as one of the most important links between the American Mafia and organized crime in Sicily, serving as boss of the Gambino family. His murder shocked New York, as no Mafia boss had been killed in the city since Paul Castellano in 1985. At first, police thought it was a mob hit, perhaps a dispute within the family. But the truth was stranger. 3 days later, authorities arrested a 24-year-old man named Anthony Camello in New Jersey. He was deeply involved in QAnon conspiracy theories and claimed he believed Calli was part of the so-called deep state. Camello even thought President Trump had given him support to make a citizen's arrest. It wasn't his first attempt at such behavior. He had previously gone after public figures like New York Mayor Bill de Blasio and Congresswoman Maxine Waters. When he appeared in court after the murder, Camello had QAnon symbols drawn on his hand. The case dragged on for years, with Camello offering different stories, while his lawyers argued he was mentally unfit. Finally, in January 2025, it was revealed that he had pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was sent to prison. But the details of his sentence were kept secret because of threats against him and his family. Frank Costello. On the evening of May 2, 1957, Frank Costello stepped out of his car and walked into his Manhattan apartment building. As he crossed the lobby, a man approached and fired a shot. The bullet grazed his head and knocked him down, but he survived. The shooter was Vincent Gigante, acting on orders from Vito Genovese. Costello lived, but the message was clear: his time as boss was over. Within days, he stepped aside, and Genovese took control of the family. Costello had been a close ally of Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Bugsy Siegel. He built his wealth during Prohibition and became famous for mixing crime with politics, earning him the nickname the Prime Minister of the Underworld. He influenced Tammany Hall politicians, judges, and even the police. His decline began in the 1950s, when he was investigated during the Kefauver hearings. Millions saw him nervously fidgeting on live television. He was later convicted of tax evasion and contempt of Congress, spending years in and out of prison. His grip on the Luciano family weakened, and Genovese seized the opportunity to rise. Even after retiring, Costello still held some influence. Leaders like Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese often visited him for advice. On February 18, 1973, at the age of 82, Frank Costello suffered a heart attack at home and died in a Manhattan hospital. Carlo Gambino. Carlo Gambino was one of the most important mob bosses of all time. After Anastasia was murdered in 1957, he took control of the family that would forever carry his name. By the 1960s, he dominated the commission, guiding not just his own men but much of the American Mafia itself. Under his rule, the Gambino family became the largest of New York's 5 families, controlling ports, trucking, unions, and rackets at JFK Airport. Unlike flashier bosses, Gambino avoided attention and rarely faced prison. His only sentence was 22 months for tax evasion back in the 1930s. On October 15, 1976, at the age of 74, Gambino spent the evening watching the New York Yankees win the American League pennant on TV. But just hours later, the heart disease that had troubled him for years took his life. Instead of handing power to his underboss, Agnello Della Croce, he chose his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, as his successor. That decision split the family and set the stage for Castellano's assassination in 1985, which we explained earlier. John Gotti. After eliminating Castellano in 1985, John Gotti became the boss of the Gambino family and revealed his unique personality. Unlike earlier bosses, he loved attention. He wore expensive suits, smiled for the cameras, and earned the nickname, the Dapper Don. But having such a high profile came with risks, and the FBI began gathering evidence against him. In 1991, his underboss, Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, turned on him. His testimony, combined with secret recordings, sealed Gotti's fate. In 1992, he was convicted of 5 murders, racketeering, loan sharking, tax evasion, and more. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole, spending nearly all of his time in isolation. By the late 1990s, his power was gone. His son and brother tried to run the family in his name, but prosecutions and informants crippled the Gambinos. At the same time, Gotti's health deteriorated. Cancer spread, and by 2002, he was too weak to fight it. On June 10, 2002, at the age of 61, John Gotti died from throat cancer. His funeral was symbolic. About 300 people followed the procession, but no representatives from the other New York families attended. The Gambino family he once ruled was divided and weakened, and many saw his death as the beginning of the Mafia's decline in America. Vito Genovese. In the late 1950s, Vito Genovese stood at the top of the Mafia world. He had forced Frank Costello into retirement, ordered the killing of Anastasia, and taken control of the most powerful family in New York. In 1957, he organized the Appalachian Mafia Summit to confirm his authority. But when police raided the meeting, it exposed the Mafia's existence to the public for the first time. Just 2 years later, in 1959, Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in prison on narcotics charges. From inside Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, he tried to run the family, but his grip on power quickly slipped away. Genovese's troubles with the law stretched back decades. In 1937, he faced murder charges and fled to Italy, where he openly supported Mussolini's fascist regime and built ties with government officials. It wasn't until after World War II that he returned to New York, cleared of charges after key witnesses turned up dead. Many believe his later conviction was the result of a setup by rivals such as Lucky Luciano or Meyer Lansky. On February 14, 1969, At the federal prison hospital in Springfield, Vito Genovese suffered a heart attack and died at the age of 71. Al Capone, often called Scarface, made his name during Prohibition as the head of the Chicago outfit. He controlled illegal alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. To the public, he was both a feared criminal and a kind of celebrity. Some admired him for giving money to charities while others saw the killings and corruption, especially after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929, when 7 members and associates of Chicago's North Side gang were murdered. The government couldn't convict him for murders or bootlegging, but they finally charged him with tax evasion. In 1931, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison, and that's where his real punishment began. Capone had contracted syphilis years earlier, likely while visiting a brothel, and he never treated it. By the time he was in prison, the disease had spread to his brain, causing neurosyphilis. He grew increasingly confused and weak, spending his last year in Alcatraz's hospital ward before being released in 1939. He spent his final years in Florida, mentally broken. By 1946, doctors said his mind had declined to that of a 12-year-old child. On January 21, 1947, at just 48 years old, Al Capone collapsed after a stroke. At first, it looked like he might recover, but his condition worsened. He developed bronchopneumonia, and a few days later, on January 25th, weakened by illness, he died from a heart attack. Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano was perhaps the man who transformed the Mafia the most. After the Castellano War, instead of proclaiming himself the new boss of bosses, he created the Commission, a council that allowed bosses from the 5 families of New York to settle disputes and share power. This was done to avoid wars, and it earned him the nickname, the father of the modern American Mafia. Unlike older bosses who wanted to keep things strictly Sicilian, Luciano believed in making alliances with anyone if it brought profit. However, power brought attention. In 1936, prosecutor Thomas Dewey convicted him of running a prostitution racket, and Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Even behind bars, he remained influential. During World War II, he made a secret deal with the U.S. Navy to help protect New York docks from Axis sabotage. In return, his sentence was reduced in 1946, but only once he accepted deportation to Italy. From then on, he lived in Naples under close watch. He could no longer openly run the Mafia in America, but he still held influence through his allies. In the 1940s, he briefly operated from Havana until U.S. pressure forced him back to Italy. Then, on January 26, 1962, at Naples Airport, Luciano collapsed and died of a heart attack after meeting with American film producer Martin Gosch, who wanted to make a movie about his life. What Luciano didn't know was that Italian drug agents were following him that day, ready to arrest him on smuggling charges. But he died before they could act. Later, his body was flown to New York, where more than 2,000 mourners attended his burial in Queens. Carlo Gambino himself delivered his eulogy.